November 20th, 1943, 8:30 hours. A young Marine on a Higgins boat faces Betio, a coral atoll once called Paradise, now a furnace of fire and smoke. The air is thick with cordite, diesel, salt, and fear. The craft shudders to a halt hundreds of yards from shore. The reef stops at cold. The ramp drops, and the world disintegrates. Nambu machine guns sweep the lagoon, turning the shallows into a field of red foam. Men step off and disappear, weighed down by packs and rifles. The coral that promised footing becomes a grave. Boats jam and burn. The assault has met its arithmetic, perfect defense against imperfect approach. Then comes a new sound, a grinding metallic churn from within the smoke. Out of the haze rises a steel shape on tracks. It does not stop at the reef. It climbs it, claws of steel finding grip, dragging itself toward the beach like some armored creature from prehistory. Its .50 calibers spark and roar. For the stranded Marines, it is a miracle. For the Japanese defenders, an impossibility. The LVT, landing vehicle, tracked, has walked on water and conquered coral. To understand the profound significance of that moment, one must understand the brutal geography of the Pacific War. The American strategy was one of island hopping, a bloody, sequential campaign across the Central Pacific. But each island was a fortress. The Japanese masters of defensive warfare had perfected their strategy. Mizugiwaku Senjutsu, defense at the water's edge. The doctrine was simple and lethal. Do not let the enemy get a foothold. Fortify the beaches, create interlocking fields of fire from concrete and coconut log bunkers, and slaughter the attackers in the water. And in the shallow lagoons of the Pacific atolls, they had a natural ally more formidable than any wall, the coral reef. These reefs, often hundreds of yards wide, lay just beneath the surface at low tide, ready to rip the bottom out of any conventional landing craft. A Higgins boat needed at least 4 feet of water. At low tide, the reefs turned these boats into stationary targets, forcing infantry to wade across hundreds of yards of open water into the teeth of a perfectly prepared defense. The Japanese commanders knew this. The reef was their ultimate weapon. The Japanese soldier, the hardened veteran of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces, expected the Americans to come. He expected them to be brave and numerous, but also predictable. He expected them to come in their flimsy, unarmored landing craft. He expected those craft to grind to a halt on the coral reef, and he expected to kill them. Methodically, dispassionately, and in great numbers. The commander of the Japanese garrison on Betio, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki, was so confident in his defenses in the reef that he boasted, "1,000,000 men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years." He had turned the tiny 1 square mile island into the most heavily fortified position on Earth. His 4,500 elite troops were dug into a labyrinth of over 500 pillboxes and bunkers, armed with naval cannons, anti-tank guns, and hundreds of machine guns. He had every inch of the lagoon zeroed in. He expected the American assault to be a bloody, catastrophic failure. He expected the reef to hold. What Admiral Shibazaki and his men experienced on the morning of November 20th, 1943, was the utter negation of their entire strategic worldview. They weathered the massive preliminary naval bombardment, which, due to errors, had largely missed its targets. They manned their guns as the American landing craft appeared. They watched with grim satisfaction as those boats grounded on the reef, just as they had calculated. They began the slaughter just as planned, and then they saw the impossible. They saw tanks crawling out of the ocean. They saw tracked vehicles that simply refused to be stopped by the reef, machines that climbed over the coral as if it were a paved road and kept coming, their guns blazing. The perfect defense, The fortress a million men could not take was being breached not by soldiers, but by a bizarre, slow-moving, and unstoppable machine. The psychological shock was absolute. The battle was no longer a predictable exercise in defensive warfare. It was a confrontation with technological witchcraft. The Mizugiwaku Senjutsu was broken. The reef had failed. The instrument of this strategic revolution was a testament to a uniquely American form of genius, civilian ingenuity, repurposed for war. The LVT was not born in a military design bureau. It was born in the swamps of the Florida Everglades. In the 1930s, a wealthy inventor, Donald Roebling, became obsessed with creating a vehicle for rescue operations after devastating hurricanes. He needed a vehicle that could traverse swamps, cross rivers, and navigate flooded terrain. The result of his privately funded effort was a tracked, amphibious vehicle he called the Alligator. It was a strange machine, but it could go anywhere. Life magazine ran an article on Roebling's invention in 1937. That article was read by officers in the United States Marine Corps. The Marines, whose existence was predicated on amphibious assault, were desperately searching for a way to get men and supplies to shore. They saw in Roebling's swamp rescue machine a potential solution to their most fundamental problem. This introduces our recurring symbolic object, a can of SPAM. To the American Marine, a can of SPAM in his sea rations was a familiar, if unglamorous, taste of home. It was processed, preserved, and endlessly available, a product of the vast, industrialized food processing system of the American Midwest. It was a symbol of a nation so productive it could feed its millions of soldiers a consistent, calorie-dense ration anywhere in the world. To a Japanese soldier subsisting on a ball of rice, the idea of a soldier carrying his own can of processed meat was an absurdity, a sign of American softness. But the can of Spam was more than food. It was a symbol of the American philosophy of logistics and abundance. The same system that could stamp out millions of cans of Spam and ship them 8,000 miles was the same system that could take a quirky civilian invention and produce it by the thousands. The LVT was, in a sense, a can of SPAM on tracks, a practical, unglamorous, mass-produced, and utterly reliable solution to a fundamental problem. The Marine Corps' initial interest in the Alligator was met with skepticism from the Navy. Roebling's vehicle was seen as a civilian novelty, but the Marines persisted. They knew they needed a solution to the reef problem. After years of negotiation, Roebling, a patriot who initially refused to sell his invention for military use, agreed to help design a militarized version. The result was the LVT-1. It was not a combat vehicle. It was an unarmored cargo carrier made of mild steel, armed with only a couple of machine guns. Its job was to ferry supplies after the beach had been secured. But a few forward-thinking Marine officers, particularly Lieutenant General Howland Mad Smith, saw its true potential. They realized this amphibious tractor was the only vehicle that could cross a coral reef. The decision was made to use a small number of these unarmored supply vehicles as assault craft for the first wave at Tarawa. It was a desperate gamble. The battle for Betio Island was a 3-day descent into hell. The first wave of LVTS, carrying the initial assault companies of the 2nd Marine Division, successfully crossed the reef and landed. But they were too few, and because they were unarmored, many were knocked out. The subsequent waves in Higgins boats were stopped at the reef as predicted. The Marines were forced to wade the last 800 yards under a storm of fire. The slaughter was immense. The first day ended with 5,000 Marines ashore in a tiny beachhead. But the LVTS had done their job. They had gotten the first wave ashore. Without them, the invasion would have failed utterly. And the LVTS that survived continued to play a decisive role. They became mobile machine gun nests, crawling along the beach to suppress pillboxes. They ferried ammunition and water. They evacuated the wounded. They were the lifeline of the entire operation. The transformation in American military thinking after Tarawa was instantaneous and absolute. The battle was a tactical victory, but a strategic lesson written in blood. The Marine Corps suffered over 3,000 casualties, but the lesson was clear. The LVT was the key. Before Tarawa, it was an obscure logistics vehicle. After Tarawa, it became the centerpiece of American amphibious doctrine. An urgent top priority program was initiated to produce thousands of new, improved LVTs. The LVT-2 Water Buffalo and the LVT-4, with a rear ramp for troops, were rushed into production, and, most importantly, armored versions were developed. The LVTA-1 and LVTA-4, known as Amtanks, were fitted with turrets mounting a 37mm or 75mm cannon. They were not just amphibious tractors anymore. They were true amphibious tanks, capable of leading an assault and providing direct, heavy fire support. The Japanese High Command also learned a lesson from Tarawa, a lesson that would make subsequent battles even bloodier. They saw that their Mizugiwaku Senjutsu, their defense at the water's edge, had been broken by a machine. They realized they could no longer count on the reef to be their ally. Their entire defensive philosophy was obsolete. In response, they developed a new doctrine, defense in depth. On islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, they would largely abandon the beaches. Instead, they would turn the entire island into a fortified kill zone, a labyrinth of interconnected caves, tunnels, and bunkers, designed to bleed the American forces white in a brutal war of attrition. The shocking success of the LVT at Tarawa forced the Japanese to retreat from the water's edge and dig into the heart of their island fortresses, setting the stage for the most savage and costly battles of the war. The LVT, now a proven and indispensable weapon, became the star of the island-hopping campaign. At Saipan, over 800 LVTs landed 8,000 Marines on the beaches in just 20 minutes. At Peleliu, LVTs navigated the treacherous shores. At Iwo Jima, they crawled through the black volcanic ash, their tracks providing the only viable traction. The image of an LVT, its rear ramp down, disgorging a squad of battle-hardened Marines, became the iconic image of the Pacific War. Imagine a group of exhausted Marines taking cover behind a knocked-out LVT after the first day on Tarawa. One pulls from his pack a battered can of SPAM and passes it around. That can, like the LVT they shelter behind, is a product of the same system. It is a symbol of a nation that could not only invent a new machine to solve a tactical problem, but could also feed its men reliably and abundantly 8,000 miles from home. In the end, the LVT Alligator was more than a successful vehicle. It was the physical embodiment of a uniquely American approach to war. It was not born of military doctrine, but of civilian ingenuity. It was not a weapon of perfect elegance, but a clumsy, practical, and brutally effective tool. It was a testament to a system open enough to see a good idea, even if it came from an eccentric inventor, and pragmatic enough to adopt it and mass-produce it on a staggering scale. The Japanese commanders who never expected to see tanks climb their beaches were not just defeated by a machine. They were defeated by a philosophy that believed no obstacle was truly impenetrable, no problem truly unsolvable, and that the best ideas could come from anywhere. The LVT was the proof of that philosophy, a strange and triumphant machine that crawled out of a Florida swamp and one bloody beach at a time helped win the largest naval war in human history. The rusted hulks of these machines still dot the lagoons of the Pacific, monuments not just to the battles they fought, but to the quiet, powerful, and relentless ingenuity of a free society.